So hello everyone, welcome to the International Macro History online seminar series. Today I will be the compare. We are delighted to have Melanie Meng Shui joining us. She has just started at the London School of Economics, Department of Economic History. Before that, she was based at NYU Abu Dhabi, and she will be presenting a paper today. The title's just disappeared from my screen here. Oh, I've got it written out. The short and long run effects of affirmative action, evidence from Imperial China. She will have 40 minutes to present the paper, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. If you have a question to ask Melanie, please type it in the Q&A and we will deal with them after her presentation. Just before Melanie starts, next week's seminar, same time, same place. The presenter will be Yannick Dupré from University College Dublin, a paper on taxation in Africa from colonial times to the present. So without further ado, Melanie, the floor is yours. Melanie's co-author is also on the call, so you have 40 minutes. I'll mute myself now.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present this joint work with Bo Xiaozhang at the International Macro History Seminar. So I will now share my screen. So this is a paper about the reform in Imperial China. Then I will go through some of the historical background and institutional context, and then introduce you to some of the main results, and then I discuss how we should think about these results and how does that help us to frame our thinking about the affirmative action policies in general. And so I'll begin with just, so this is some of the basic, like the very stylized facts about the system and talking about today, and the Imperial examination system, but then also is the reform, which is the reform that was carried out in the 1712. And then the fact that it's actually very similar to the modern affirmative action policies in so many respects. And then we would like to study this partly for this reason. So the Imperial examination system, I think this is one of the things that it should really catch the attention almost right away if you have any interest in East Asian history and in general, because it is, I would say, highly unusual for a pre-modern state to both have a fairly well-established and well-functioning bureaucracy, but also has this way of systematically recruit talents in order to staff this bureaucracy. So we are not going to be getting into what exactly this bureaucracy does. That's a kind of besides the point, but this does serve as the general background for the paper, which is we are studying the reform that was targeted and was designed in order to this reform was designed to improve the equality or the general welfare consequences of this examination system, which is a core piece of the economic and the political institutions of Imperial China. So, the examination system itself has some of the characteristics. I will be very happy to go into in details and really in the Q&A session if the questions comes up. But basically, this is a system that is very useful in order to get these people in order to get them to be part of the government. So the implications of having this system is that then instead of having traditionally for most pre-modern states, you're having the aristocrats or the lords and feudal lords. So instead of having that, so you do have a system that is it is inclusive of the ordinary people, but without the actual political representation. So I think it's both ways. Thinking about how good the system is. It's both it is open to more, but it also is not quite restricted because it doesn't really comes with any political benefits. So there is 3 degrees available. You have each level have at the lowest level getting those degrees called Shenyuan, and then also the Zhuzhen and the Jingshi. So today our discussion will be mostly about the 3rd tier, the highest tier, and also the most prestigious degrees you can get from these exams. So each year there's usually for each exam, which happens every 3 years, you'll have a number of successful candidates who will obtain those degrees. And now we're curious about if we make this exam, instead of having a national exam, but we're making it, tweaked the exam system a little bit. So then people from different parts of the China is going to have a different chance to pass the exam. What would that do? And how does that affect those inequality both within and across regions? So, so some of the traits of this reform. So I think maybe I just show you one thing about this exam system, just so you have a little bit of a context. So basically, this is exam that is tested as candidates on the basis of their literary talent. So this is, you can also think of this as like an IQ test, but it requires preparation. So instead of having an IQ test, which just directly sort all the candidates based on how smart they are, but this is a test that is possible to prepare for. So in order to prepare for this test, usually those candidates will be learning those classics for years. It's unclear how useful this knowledge is, but however, this does require them to at least acquire basic literacy and some type of cognitive skills, which is generally useful for many different tasks and skills. And then those are candidates usually will be just going to getting this education at home, or sometimes went to their local schools. So those are ways to acquire this to be prepared for the exams. And there is very little public schools available. And there is not none, but there's not. It doesn't really have the modern general education or the mass schooling systems. So that is really not there. Okay, so in terms of the reforms, I think I briefly touched upon the one thing that reform did is that it changed the way that the competition was setting up. So instead of having this as a national exam, just thinking of this as a SAT and just having the same exam for everyone, and doesn't matter where you're from. And so it will be like then ordered or sorted based on the scores. This is the exam that is, it turns out that if you do it that way, then it will discover too much differences across different parts of China. For many different reasons, because they're not very equally prepared and have a different history of being part of the Chinese empire. All those things creates disparities. And to the extent that there is so much differences, then the exam could only be leading to a very unfair situation, or at least being perceived as unfair by many parts of the country. So facing this situation, what the ruler did at the time was that they were trying to tweak the system. It's not a major change. You just think about this, what exactly they did is then they just made it proportional to the actual number of people who participated in the exam, and then make the success rates the same across different parts of the country. So that is to say, if you have some weak province which send 50 people, then 5 of them will getting those degrees. If it's rich or some kind of a province with a longer tradition in exams or much better prepared, then they would also have the same percentage of candidates that pass the exam. So implicitly, this does mean you have just different criteria for different parts of the country. And this will be it will just mechanically will lead to a different distribution of successful candidates across those different groups. And in other words, the competition became confined to within the provinces. And the criteria is now beginning to vary from province to province instead of having the same criteria for all parts of the country. So to note, I think an immediate question I have is, why wouldn't I just go in some place? I know that we'll have easier time to to pass the exam? Well, the answer is it is actually very difficult to do that because you would need to be formally registered in the province in order to be considered as a candidate from there. And in order to establish this formal residency, it usually takes decades. It is like it has to be where your grandfather is from or born in, not just you. And this is part of the reason why this system is actually harder to arbitrage than you think. And it's definitely harder to arbitrage compared to the modern systems, thinking about the top 10% of the students all gets to go to selective college, which is the system you have in California and Texas for a long time. So that is that wouldn't really require you to have been located in exactly like the school district for the past 3 generations. So there is a pretty big difference in how easy it is to arbitrage. So it's indeed true. I think it's worth acknowledging that this is not the first time you have this system, have any type of attempts to equalize the chance across areas of China in terms of how likely it is to pass the exam. It is one of the reform that has been done. So previously, there's also some earlier attempts to also tweak this system to make it a bit more fair, but nothing was exactly the way we're looking at today. So previously, we had some kind of also region-based quota, but it's at a higher level. And instead of having just changing the rules systematically to have the successful candidates to be a percentage of everyone who attended, the previous system would be imposing quota just like a share-based quota. So your different parts of China will be getting a fixed share each time, and it's regardless of the participation. So that's an important difference. And so just one more thing on this reform, so you have some idea about what was on the mind of the ruler. So in his mind, the problem that he was facing is that, so he was, as a popular monarchy or this type of political region, that he very much worried about how it is perceived by the ordinary people, because I mean, obviously, they did not really have any other allies to the empire other than just the people themselves. So it needs to at least come across as fair. So then this situation is obviously violate or against his goal and interests. Right? He's looking at this each exams many times, observing the same pattern, which is you have those candidates traveling from far away or having very humble background. So they made all that effort possible to participate in the exam, but often because the competition is so fierce, you have some much better prepared candidates who end up getting all the successful, being the only ones who succeed in the past exam. So from his point of view, that it would be obviously ideal that he can somehow to set some type of a quota by province. So then making sure that no matter where they're from, a certain percentage of those candidates will pass the exam. So that's something in the background. And then eventually this resulted in the change in 1712. And then they just decided to change the rule formally. So from that point on, the exam was no longer nationally held. It was, well, it is still held in the capital, but it was is going to be based on the standard is going to become more relative or to be a more province-based standard. So this, as to literature, the literature we like to speak to is this literature on affirmative action policies. So this is a very long-standing literature. I think it has went through several phases. It started off as a very purely theoretical literature, mostly just explore the implications of having those interventions at all, and usually the theoretical literature will conclude that this is not very efficient because obviously you would not be selecting people who are the most prepared. So the theoretical literature I think is pretty straightforward. But then the more empirical literature has started to find a very different things. For one is they realize that at least once they're looking in, taking into account the response from those candidates and the more disadvantaged groups especially, then empirically they do find evidence that it's possible to have positive effects of those affirmative actions policies, so at least for the underrepresented groups. But then over time, it's also possible for them to improve in the economic performance, so which means the policy overall could also be good for society as a whole, as long as you're looking at like several periods after or with some other conditions. The reason for this is because there's also the role model effect. So once you have certain candidates who are doing well, especially from some groups who are underrepresented and so badly before, and then most people would have no idea that they should even attempt. So these are studies done on Texas. I think they find not only just there are more of those students from underrepresented groups, they also ended up doing better. Now, those are also very encouraging results from this more recent literature on affirmative action. And then they are, interestingly enough, there is very little evidence in this empirical literature for mismatch effect. So usually we think about mismatch effect is you place someone who is not very well prepared in a selective college, then they will end up doing poorly because they are not prepared. But empirical literature actually tends to find that there is very little evidence for the mismatch effect, even though theoretically speaking, it's quite possible. And then lastly, I think this is interesting. Also, is something that is similar to what we find is the distributional consequences, which is even though we do find some positive effects at the group level and even sometimes at a society level. But one concern about those policies is the gains were really absorbed by the most ahead group, subgroup within those groups. So in the context of India, I think what the literature finds is it's only the low-case individuals from the strongest socioeconomic backgrounds that benefit most. And what we do in this paper is we also just like trying to track this over time to see what happens in the long run. Because in the very short run, I think this is quite obvious. Once you implement this reform, it is going to be the most prepared candidates in those groups that get the benefits first. But I think what we add to this, or we provide insights, and is able to unique insights we can provide is what happens in the long run. Okay, so in terms of the definition of the affirmative action, so unfortunately, this is a very complicated and difficult and controversial concept. There's not a whole lot of agreement in what exactly the affirmative action policies are and what counts as affirmative action. But in general, I think the literature tends to agree that you have a affirmative action policy that is usually designed to improve the position of the groups that have been disadvantaged or underrepresented. But this, unfortunately, because this definition also changes from time to time depending on the court rulings. So here we're going to keep it really broad in general, and then we're just thinking, we're looking at a situation where there is group level differences and there is an intervention that is going to change how big the differences is. Here, I think what's worth emphasizing is the affirmative and the reform we're looking at, and in terms, if you worry about the normative aspect of this or the motivations, then it was more linked to the proto-egalitarianism than like the modern notions of civil rights, because obviously this is Imperial China and there wasn't really any, at least there's no any fleshed out argument about civil rights. And the ruler was more worried about the perceived fairness and the concerns about the political stability. So those are the motivations. And there's no direct links to political representation, but also not patronage, because this is just a straightforward imperial autocracy. So the ruler is not formally constrained in any way. So it's not, has no commitments to any other elites and their interests. So which actually simplifies the issues quite a lot. And in terms of our contribution, so we are looking at this pretty large scale policy experiment, because for reasons such as it doesn't really, it's not really formally constrained in any ways. So it is very simple policy experiment towards this group level averages. And then what we're trying to figure out is that first, is that really extended any opportunities to these individuals in underrepresented provinces, both in the short run and in the long run. And then, but also we're trying to provide some insights into how the gains were shared, and especially how it is shared over the long run. And we are interested also in the spillovers and the mechanisms, but there's I mean, so far we haven't been able to find a very good way to study this. So it's something we have to do in the future. So we have this data for China and pro-China. Some of this has been used before, such as the number of the successful candidates. But some of the new data we are adding in terms of the ranks of these candidates and also their positions in the bureaucracy afterwards. And then we are taking the first step, which is to quantify this reform, because the reform itself is just changing the rules. We went from having this be national, national competition toward a more region-based competition. But in terms of how much, what is the effective reform intensity for each of those areas, we have to somehow measure this. So the way we did this is to try and to compare the share of each of those provinces before and after the reform. So when we plot this on the graph, I think it's pretty obvious that this reform is associated with the initial level of this in each of these provinces, how much they account for in the national exam. So the greater the share they had, and then they tend to have seen their share fall after the reform. So in other words, the reform is trying to bring the share more similar across these provinces. And to give an example, which I do just like a very simple sketch this example to illustrate the point. For example, if we have this province in the previous period and long before the reform, they were about 30% of all the candidates in their region, like the South China here region means. And then after the reform, they can see a decline in the share. So now they are only 10% of this area. So they're only 25% of this area. So the comparison is before and after the reform. And then the province B, which was a lower share before the reform, which is only 10%. Then afterwards, then they became 20% of the share. So they were more similar to province A after the reform. So here we are trying to see and using this difference in here just to as a measure of a proxy for the reform intensity for each of the province. And then we're trying to figure out, for one, I think the obvious one is they are having more of these candidates have been successful afterwards. This is obviously, I think it's already been implied, but also if there was any kind of a positive change in their outcomes. So were those candidates who were newly qualified for those jobs, or are they also having a better academic performance and also ended up having a better job? So we would be using this estimating equation on the slides, which is trying to looking at those provinces that saw a positive change in their share, but also the provinces that saw a negative change in their share before and after the reform, and with some of those controls mostly to control for those provincial specific trends and other fixed effects, regular ones, decade fixed effects and province fixed effects. And then we can the region fixed effect, sorry. And then we can just by previewing these results, when do this both for the academic outcomes and the professional outcomes, which is their end of jobs they hold at the government. And what we find is there is a pretty strong positive effects for everyone from the province that saw a positive change in their share. So this is to say not only that those provinces that benefited from the reform had seen more of the successful candidates, but those candidates also did better in the exam. So this is actually quite consistent, did better than before. So this is quite consistent with the findings in this Bloomer's papers about California, but also the Texas 10% reform. So they were seeing also the improvement in the GPAs for the successful candidates. And here we are seeing the ranks also moved up over time after the reform. And we don't really find a whole lot for the losing provinces or provinces who are lost out. So there's like not a whole lot going on for those other provinces. And then we find this reform in terms of their, so the province average, which is not looking at the individual level, but the province level instead. And then in this case, there is actually some negative effects for all the provinces that lost the shares. This makes sense, I think, to some extent. And then what we do is then we're looking at their positions in the bureaucracy, because I think a lot of you will be wondering that, the exam itself is just some tool. After all, we're trying to, what we're really interested in is, anything happens in the real world. So the exam was going to staff the bureaucracy, and what happens to the bureaucracy or the candidates, the modern day parallel will be their labor markets. I think what we find is there's very little going on that side. So there is some positive signs, but they're not really statistically significant. But this does become a bit different if we do it at a province average level. So there's also some indication that their positions and the quality of their jobs were also better than before. However, there is this caveat that this results is much more fragile compared to the results of other exam ranks. Depending on the treatment you use. So we have other ways to construct the treatment, and we find that this results is much more uncertain when you're using other type of treatment. So I think our conclusion is then, although there was also there's also very encouraging evidence that those candidates were investing more, and the exam system draw more qualified candidates into competition, which resulted in also an increase in their performance in the exam itself. But it would take a lot more for them to actually do better in this competition and later in the labor markets. Probably because the labor markets had other factors going on, the pre-existing networks and many other things that can also affect how well they do. So this looks like it will be a much longer run process for this all to catch up. And then this is one of the alternative treatment we used. One is instead of looking at the share of each of those provinces in the period immediately before 1650, we look at even earlier period when this exam was fully nationally competitive. And then this is there are some trade-offs especially using these different measures. But using this treatment, I think we're finding pretty similar results in terms of the ranks. But then, as I said, that don't really find a whole the results were much weaker for their positions in the bureaucracy. So some of the results goes away when we use this other measure. Okay, so there's another, I think, much worse emphasizing point in our in this study, which is the distributional consequences of the reform. Previously, this is not as studied as much as just the group level results. Other than the study, I guess I mentioned about Bertrand's work on India. But there is some attention to these results because we're interested in, I think mostly it's from the political economy side, because I think that literature wants to know who is more supportive of affirmative action policies. Right? Is that the rich or so within, it's usually modern democratic settings. We think that's like the literature will be looking at the distributional consequences. But other than that, there's very little attention to this issue. Here we are able to both looking at this problem, but also looking at them for over long time periods that some of the advantage our studies has. So the obvious question is how were those reforms, how the gains were shared, and more specifically, that's how did this gene density change in the sub-provincial units, both in prefecture level, but also the county level. And the prefecture differed in their pre-existing strengths in human capital, ended up gaining disproportionately more or less from this reform. And then we estimate, this boils down to the estimation of the heterogeneous impact of this reform on the gene density, varying by a prefecture's pre-existing strengths in human capital. So this is the regression, the econometric translation of the question we're interested in. So to illustrate why this could be important and the relevant question, so as you can tell, and this is actually a whole lot of heterogeneity in their performance, not just across provinces, which is like the larger units on this map. This is one province, for example. This is like coming from here, somewhere in the central China. And if you zoom in to this province, then you see so much differences within this provinces. Some parts of this provinces were far better and had far more successful candidates on the per capita basis than others. So then the natural question is, once you drop some goodies or some benefits onto those provinces, how would they be distributed? And not just like right at that moment, but also over time. And then what we find using this estimating equation is, this is just compared to before, we are going one level down, right? We're going to the prefecture level. And also we are adding this one interaction term, which allows us to compare prefectures that were had greater pre-existing strengths in human capital versus prefectures that had were less prepared or had less human capital before. And then what we find is we're learning this similar equation, but with slightly more ability to control for more things, because now we are at the prefecture level, which is 280 prefectures, 250 prefectures altogether, and over 13 time periods, 13 decades. And this allows us to control for those prefecture fixed effects and also the decade fixed effects and the provincial heterogeneous time trends. Means you're taking out all those differences at a province and a decade level, and then this also allows us to allows the trends to be related to the prefecture's initial conditions, such as how agriculturally suitable they are and how populous they are, and how many of the lower level exam quota they were receiving. And then we so it shouldn't happen. I think there's a let's see. Probably something was so sorry. So there is a slide should be there before, but so instead of showing you the slide, then I'll be showing you this on the graph instead. And so if you so to remind you again, so we have this equation which is an interaction term, right, between the how much they gained from this reform. This is our reform intensity variable, and the pre-existing strengths in human capital is how it's like the endowments of those prefectures, but then on the post period. So if we draw this graph and separately by provinces that gained or lost from this reform, then this is what you end up with. This is we have this over period. You can draw this over period, which is for these provinces that have benefited from this reform. You will have some of the up and downs, but in general they are positive. But for provinces that lost out for this reform, this is almost always positive. This is to say that this is always the prefectures that gain that had the greatest human capital strengths before the reform that benefit the most from this reform. So this is true both for provinces that benefited from from the reform, but also for provinces that was negatively impacted from the reform. So here, I think the way to read this graph is that they lost out the least relative to the other prefectures in those provinces. They still did relatively better because they were more human capital before in those prefectures. Right. So there is a number of issues we worry about. So when its population might have changed during this period, so we're showing these results. But then so this is give you some idea about the main estimation. So if we take into account population change in those provinces, and then this is just going to be a measure of the change in the share among the provinces before and after, even after taking into account their population changes. And then this is what we find. So as you saw in the previous graph, that it's very similar effects. So for both losing and the gaining provinces. For both, it is the prefectures that had the greatest human capital strength before. They were deriving the most benefit from this reform. And this is true, both you group them together and the big sample, the 5,000 or those observations, or having those been divided into their separate samples. So for both, in both cases, I think it's pretty obvious that, especially for the gaining provinces, that is only the prefectures that were most prepared are deriving the most benefit. All right, so we are doing the same thing for rankings and positions, and it seems like it's pretty similar as well over there. And we are finding a greater benefit in their performance and their job placement. If those are prefectures that had the advantage before, and for the same thing for the government performance and positions in the government. And that's lastly, not lastly, so for this set of analysis, we're also looking at just one more robustness and for the county decade level. So now we are going and one further level down. So here we are having altogether 1,800 counties instead of only having 280 prefectures. But we are doing that almost exactly the same regression as before. And we still find that it is counties that had the greatest advantage before the reform that ended up getting the most benefits from the reform. So, so I think we still have a bit of time on. So last set of results. So here, I think the question will be, there is something that is changing the pattern we just saw, which is basically saying there is a greater increasing inequalities within those provinces after the reform. So there is something that is actually able to reverse this trends to some extent or to mitigate those divergent trends. So this is what we find. So because one of the disadvantage of these provinces is because they were far away from where the exam was held. So it literally took months for them to travel to this capital. So this could be very costly, right, for a marginal candidate if they were not sure if they're going to pass the exam or not. Then because being far away, they're going to really discourage them from attending those exams. And because sometimes they took multiple choice, this could be quite a substantial factor. So we're testing if there are provinces or prefectures that those exam agencies or the funding agencies were prevalent, so they are able to, for average exam candidates, they can always be sponsored or subsidized to go. If that is going to have any material impact on how much they fall behind after this reform. So indeed, what we find is if you are a prefecture that had a smaller, the word less, they had less exam success before, but you are in one of those prefectures that had those funding agencies, then the difference or the gap you have relative to those prefectures that were doing better before and is going to be insignificant. So this is not going to be a big difference after the reform. So they were receiving similar benefits from the reform. And as long as there is this funding agencies on the grounds that is going to help those candidates to travel to the capital. So this is sort of, I think it's an encouraging news or a silver lining, if you want to say, and it means there is it's not inevitable this growing inequality within those provinces. So lastly, we were able to also do a little bit, but not a whole lot yet, as to beyond this period where those exams were taken and they were held in this using this exam were still in place to recruit those candidates. So this is about 200 years after. So we are able to look at after 1911. So 1911 is when you have the end of the empire. So afterwards, you don't have any of those exams anymore. So this is like a very different time area, the time period. So then we're looking at exams, still exams, but it's for like the selective colleges. This is more similar to that or the modern education. So here we're trying to figure out if those pre-existing, like the previous reforms have any long-term effects. And so at the province level, so far, we only find some indication that there is some positive effects still being retained, even after the this reform. I mean, even after the reform was phased out, but this requires further investigation. So partly because we have very few observations, and so here we are no longer having those decades. So we're just looking at 3 time periods before and then in between, and then after the 1911. So we are trying to find a way to actually examine this in a more systematic way and with statistical relevance. But we are also doing something within provinces. So here we do find that some of the same patterns were continuing, like those are prefectures that derive the greatest benefits from these reforms. It seems like there is some of the continuation, at least for those losing provinces. It appears that it is those prefectures had the greatest strengths, they were the ones who were able to avoid being disadvantaged after the reform. But this is the most preliminary part of the analysis, and we will not be going into it any further. So just to summarize, so we're looking at this reform that is a policy intervention to this imperial examination system, which is a system that was mostly to staff the bureaucracy, but has implications for social mobility in the pre-modern state. And this reform was supposed to extend the opportunities to more individuals, especially those in the more frontier provinces. And then we find is that they did have some of these effects, but it also comes with some of the unintended consequences, especially for those within provinces inequalities. The gap didn't really close over time, but however, if there were prefectures that had those subsidies, right, with additional subsidies to help these candidates, it is possible to at least see these benefits will be more evenly distributed. So it's several twists in the messages we're trying to convey, but I think this is to my knowledge, this is pretty true to reality. This is going to have a reform with some of those benefits, but this benefits doesn't really just come to all people and all intended to benefit intended individuals as we wish. It requires further effort to actually achieve the goal, if that was the intended purposes of this reform. So from the point of view of the ruler, perhaps this is good enough because you have some kind of a balancing of the interests, and then there is less possibility to have those political instability in frontier regions. But if you were a modern policymakers, perhaps you have to do a little bit more than just having a reform targeted at the group level. All right, so this is all we have. I think this is time for questions. I think thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you very much, Melanie. That was a very, very nice presentation of your work and really helped me understand your paper better. So those in the audience who wish to ask questions should put the question in the Q&A. Whilst you're all doing that, perhaps I will start things off with a question or two myself whilst we're waiting. So let me think. Oh yeah. So in the paper, you describe the career trajectory of these successful candidates who then go into the civil service, and there's 18 ranks, and they range from village chief to prime minister. And I was wondering what the connection could be between passing this test, which is, as you said, on all kinds of literary things, right? How can that be linked to, a chance of becoming prime minister? What skills are embedded in doing that test that help someone progress up the ladders of the civil service? Do you have an idea? It plays to the mechanism, I guess, a little bit.
So yes, so this is actually in itself is a very interesting question. I think there is no really consensus on this. But in general, I mean, we think of this as just a general preparation for having a job that's like a white collar job, right? So this is mostly a bureaucracy, which means they are going there to do some of this work. It's somewhere in between, I guess, being a politician and being a bureaucrat. But in general, these people were considered as both at least they will be literate, right? Compared to like massive population, 95% of the population will not be literate. And then they are Confucian, right? Like more moral people, right? So this is why I think Chinese state is sometimes be seen as a mix between like a Catholic church and just like a traditional pre-modern state. So there's also I think that, right, the moral aspect of this.
Would these people carry around their results for their career? Would this be a signal that, a badge of honor, the rank in the tests, that kind of thing? Could that help explain, their allocation in the bureaucracy?
So I think I forgot to mention. I saw a straightforward link. If we set aside about this, how good a preparation this is. Straightforward link is that this is all this is all managed by the personnel department, like the Bureau of Personnel. So they literally just use this rank because it's like a modern civil service exam. They just use this rank to decide their position. So there is like a pretty straightforward linear link. We're not showing you here in the slides, but I think in the paper there is like a little table to show there is this very simple positive correlation between the exam rank and the position in the government. So they were being assigned to these various positions based on their exam rank. So that is why there is this link, and then there should be also as well, right? If there's yeah.
You measure over the life course, so it's the highest rank obtained through their career. Okay, Rui has a question. Rui, if you can unmute yourself, I think you have the ability to do that.
I do. Thanks. Yes, and actually, I have two questions, and the second question sort of feeds on what Chris was asking you, right? So we all know these sorrowful stories of scholars who tried n times to pass any of these levels of exams, right? And clearly, not all of them, right? But some of them clearly had the aim of getting to the top exam, and some didn't, right? But for some, it's not like you could submit yourself immediately to the hardest exam. You first had to pass the other ones. Now, my understanding is that the real selection was at the lowest level. I remember reading part of a book on this, and I correct me if I'm wrong, because of course you know these things. But I think the approval rate at the Sheng Yuan level was 1.5%, whereas the approval rate at the Jinchi, which is the one you're looking, of course, this is conditional on passing the middle one, was 33%. Right? So, the ones who got to the level you're studying were already super selected. So my question is actually whether you're not biasing down your results because you're not looking at potentially trickle-down effects on the other level. So for instance, you observe, I don't know if there's data, but you observe an increase in enrollment. You could also have looked at the level you're studying, the Jinchi, and see whether you would not only the share would increase, but the numbers, the overall numbers would increase, right? As people perceive that they had a fair share of passing the exam. And whether that also translated to the lower levels, and in particular, the super selective first level.
Yeah, so we're very much interested in the trickle-down effects. And in fact, this is why I think this exam system, even though the actual passing rate is so low, I mean, so few people actually passed it, but it has like a much larger effect than just these people because precisely because of this trickling down effect. One thing we're going to do very quickly is to look at the literacy down below and in the later period. I mean, we don't have any idea about literacy in the earlier period, but we do know it somewhere around 1900, I think it becomes possible to construct some estimates for literacy. And in addition to this, indeed, I mean, I think the lower level exams must have changed in the respondent. So we cannot do, unfortunately, I think it's hard to do this for the very lower level because that thing is controlled by a quota too. So this is not the thing that changed before and after the reform. So you have the same number of people who passed the lower exam before and after. So what might have changed is the quality of those people have increased, right? Because now you have a more competitive pool. But we cannot observe that. So that's like a challenge about how to precisely study the lowest level exam. But we can, I think it was still worth looking at and possible to do is the middle level, because for middle level, we do have some data on that. So we do think there will be some effects on just a level below. I think this is a very interesting, I think, especially in the mechanism side, just to see like people are becoming more keen or they participate more, prepare more. So that's, I think we were trying to do indeed. But yeah, all these questions are, I think all these things we were trying to do, and I think it is possible to do as well with our setting and some of the.
If you have the data, it's fairly straightforward to do. And the other thing, just so that I make sure I understand your results. So overall, you find that indeed the disadvantaged provinces gain in terms of their shares of approvals. That's mechanical, right? Because the system was created so that, right, they would all be represented by their enrollment rate rather than by the relative success across provinces of their applicants, right? So you show that. But then you show that, when you move on to the distribution of effect, right? It seems, I'm looking at figure 6, which really confused me. Because it seems that it's the losing provinces that are gaining in share.
Which one?
Yeah, you just shown that one.
This one, right?
Yeah.
So this is actually at the prefecture level. So this is the way. This is not the losing provinces. This is like within losing provinces. It is the prefectures with like more candidates, right? Like were most successful before. They continue to do better than their neighbors. So it's like within the losing provinces. Of course, overall they will be having a lower share, right? But this share, I mean, taking that, it will still have the same problem as before about who's getting what. So it is, I think, when everyone was doing, it was getting less. It is those prefectures that had the more before, they continue to get more relative to other prefectures.
And this is not explained by enrollment.
So yeah, so also this is all number as well, the dependent variable. Oh, so I think I forgot to answer one question about number. So the thing is, the overall number is controlled. So this is number, it doesn't really just increase. It's not like, oh, as long as you pass the same exam, like SAT 1500, then everyone is good. And it's not a thing. I mean, the overall target, I think, also fluctuates up and down. It has centralized the control on that. So it's hard to say the number. Just look at the raw number.
No, I know, but if the overall bureaucracy is expanding, right?
Better
job prospects overall, right? It might be.
So it's actually the opposite. The overall bureaucracy did not expand, even though the population really increased. If there's very complicated issues on that side as well, but the overall bureaucracy didn't really expand. If anything, the intake was smaller because they couldn't find a job for everyone. Every year, there's more people coming getting FAST exams, but there's no jobs. So what they did is they actually changed it to be a smaller number of people for some exams. Yeah.
Thank you.
I noticed that the scales on these panels are different. So that's a bit confusing. Just.
So for that, so our prefecture analysis therefore has this province interaction term with decades, right? So that actually accounts for most of this differences because each exam are different.
Right. But just as a piece of visualization, I think it might be easier if you use the same scale. Is what I'm saying.
Oh, I mean this thing, but this is our coefficients. So
exactly, So we have a question from David Mitch, who asked, to what extent was grading these exams subject to corruption, bribery, and exertion of personal influence? Do you have any sense of that? Were they administered, very fairly, or was there scope for dodgy business?
Oh yes, so this obvious question we'll be getting. So in general, we think, okay, so on the side of the penalty, it's pretty harsh. So I think this is always what's mentioning. Modern day, so for sure, if there's someone who goes to this national exam and cheated, they probably are not allowed to, at least the exam this time around, they would not be, would not be valid. I'm not sure if there's any consequence for other exams. So previously, the pre-modern day regime, they're actually making a pretty big deal of this. So there's different types of cheating, right? Sometimes this is more systematic or corruptions. And when that happens, people who involved in this were actually getting death penalty or getting like exiled to some remote provinces. But remember, this is an imperial autocracy, right? They don't have to justify it. It's not like we have to all agree that we can do this to people who violate the law or what. they would just do it. So there were people who are actually being recorded as like, being like sentenced to death penalty because he.
Okay, yes.
Like,
I wish I had
revealed
that.
the details and all that.
Wish I had that power as a lecturer. Sometimes. Incentives matter. Okay, well that's an interesting interesting feature of the system. One thing that I noticed with your results was that they change if you look at the unit of analysis. So the province level, for some of your results, you find significant larger effects, and then for the prefecture, the results sort of disappear. And I was wondering whether you could explain what's driving that.
Sorry, so what was the question again? So you're saying the results between province and prefectures?
Yes.
So between province and prefecture, this is two very different analysis, because at the province level, we expect this is it should be a province previous with less lower share before, now you should have more share, right? Because the reform is only at the province level. Whereas for prefecture, this is distributional questions. This is like almost entirely different from the province. So here we are trying to see.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're trying to see this. I think indeed this is why we're trying to emphasize, right? We go from province to prefecture. This is not just going one level down, being more disaggregated. This is an entirely different analysis, because the province level, it should be provinces that have less before should have more. But within the provinces, is this still true? I mean, first, there is no reason to think this is true. And the second, we're showing that this is really the opposite. And because once they're receiving the benefits, then it's open competition again within the provinces across all prefectures. And so that's, when we find it's just the prefectures are going to be, they will have a competition among themselves and end up having the situation I just described. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Nathan.
I really enjoyed the presentation. I have a question or a comment related to the affirmative action framing of this. To what extent this is affirmative action in the way we perceive it today, in the sense there was no, so what was this? I mean, so obviously there was some previous, you're arguing some previous discrimination against provinces due to distance and costs or whatever, and that is slightly different than, I guess, what we mean today by affirmative action in many ways. And again, is there kind of a selection where candidates from because I can't see the individual data, but is it the case that on average the performance of the candidates from the disadvantaged provinces was lower than the one from the more advantages of the ones with pre-existing human capital, the ones who were favored before the reform? So are they admitting in some sense people with a little bit lower quality just for the sake of generating some dynamics and affirmative action as the way we perceive them today? Or was it simply a kind of barrier to entry that was removed, and basically the selection processes that really smart people that beforehand couldn't apply just because of distance, some other barrier, transaction costs, now can apply? So just kind of fine-tuning the affirmative action perspective of this versus lowering transaction costs to some other effect.
Okay, so so modern day affirmative action. So first, there's already a big debate on what counts as affirmative action policy. So I think what you are thinking of is also a thing about like equal opportunity versus the explicit affirmative action, which is also different. So in this case, I haven't really thought about this is just equality, equal opportunity, or is the more drastic intervention. This is actually a good point. I need to think about this. The barrier to entry, I think it's similar to you saying of equal opportunity laws, which is indeed a bit different in the literature. So in general, we think this is useful because this is it changes regardless of it's also what motivations. It changes how likely it is for the individuals to pass things down, right? So that's like the thing we're interested in the most. And then how the individuals respond. If they like begin to invest more, since now there's a higher chance or reasonable chance, and some chance to as increasing return to their education. So that's, I think, the common features. I think will be irrespective of the political context. But yeah, so I do think there is a difference in the group level average. I think we are supposed to show this. But from anecdotal evidence, this is also a pretty obvious differences, because I think in the beginning of this reform, it was like for the lowest level exam, you can just become a successful, like pass this exam with like knowing a few words. So that's what they said. Whereas in the more advanced regions, like, I mean, obviously I could probably know like 2,000 characters or something, even just to pass the lowest exam. Yeah, so there's a pretty big difference. The question obviously is if that gap ever like completely closed, which I think is unlikely, but at least we find there's some trends towards like more similar levels, which is still saying that reform did have some incentivizing effect on individuals.
So we've come to the close of the more formal section of the seminar, but we're going to stay online for another 15 minutes, and other people can join and speak, and your co-author can also join in if he's still here. So thanks very much for the excellent seminar, and you know, I hope this paper does well. It's very interesting work that you're doing, with lots of research plans for the future.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Yeah.
Well, thanks for accepting the invitation. So we have a question from Stefano Battalossi. Stefano, if you want to come online, or I can ask your question. He asked, was the reform part of an effort to build a multi-ethnic identity for China? And if so, do your results suggest it achieved its goal? Let me just find. Yeah, I've clicked on Stefano. If you want to join us to ask your question in another way, feel free.
No, you just beautifully summarized what I wrote in the Q&A. So
yeah.
The question is there, so I'm curious
Excellent.
about the answer. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, is that me? My turn now?
Yeah, yes. If you if you have an answer for that.
Yeah, I do think that is right. So this is, in that sense, it's very similar to like the 1920s when the Soviet also trying to build their multi-ethnicity empire. There's some differences in exactly what they did, and they didn't really last very long. I think they only like went on for a few years. There is that aspect, and in fact, this also is related to the earlier question about what exactly is the disadvantage, right? So one of the disadvantages, because the newly integrated territories obviously wouldn't have as much knowledge or familiarity with, you know, the Han traditions or the classics. So if you just free competition, then it will never catch up, right? In some sense. So I think that's also when it was one source of disparities. We don't have any empirical results on like how successful it is to make it a multi-ethnicity empire. If I think about a way to do it, I will let you know. But I do think it probably was both part of the considerations, but also something probably did help.
Thank you. So Melis has a question. I'm going to unmute Melis, or I can summarize. It's up to you. Melis has a follow-up question indeed. So Melis, the floor is yours if you are up for it.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Melania. I really enjoyed the presentation. I was trying to understand the distribution of capital, or human capital, between counties at your sort of sub-level, because you mentioned that there is this asymmetry between the prefecture and the other counties. And so I'm wondering if you could tell more how the individual prepare for the exam, what are the resources they use, is it better to be in a prefecture because you have access to some library or something like this? And then the follow-up question was whether the reform created a change in the distribution of human capital in counties previously underrepresented. And my idea was like, if you know you have a better chance to be successful at the exam thanks to reform, then you have more incentive to train yourself for the exam, something like that. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, there's many things that goes into the initial distribution. So one thing I think was a pretty important factor is that there was like refugees from North China to South China when there was invasion from the nomads. So that really changed the distribution. That's one of the reasons why you had this reform, I think the earlier one, in 1425. This reform was introduced because I think I have a slide for this, but this reform was introduced when you saw there was literally no candidate from North China passed the exam. So that was the period where both there was war and famine attacking the North China much more than the South China. But it's also not too long after you have the refugees, so the migration, and especially it's the rich who were able to migrate from the north, and this further increases the differences. So like in the south and the Yangtze Delta area, those are just going to be all this rich and people with higher human capital or more congregated in South China. But then there's also other differences that I mentioned. So some areas are just not being exposed to those the same tradition and the exam knowledge you needed compared to other areas. So the individuals, so there's also, I think, a little bit of a discussion on this, as it's mostly private education. So you getting those educations at home or at the clan schools. Once they do pass the lowest level exams, then they started to get a small stipend and also some training and the government sponsored academies. But it's mostly at home. So this is partly why I do think without intervention, this inequalities would only build upon itself, because there's no easy way to level the field. If there is some initial differences, it's going to magnify over time because you can only receive education at home. So if there were more exam books before or more successful candidates before, then they're going to be more in the future. That was the system. And I do think if there is any type of a publicly provided education, it would be quite different. Also the outcome of this reform will be quite different. That said, it is pretty equal by a lot of standards because it's used, they intentionally make it a minimalist list of books. So you only need to read like 4 books for the most part for this exam. That does lower the barrier. So instead of having like a very broad test and trying to test you on all aspects of knowledge, they just need some knowledge, right? I mean, not some very good knowledge, but of like a small, very narrowly defined list of things, which presumably makes it easier to access for most people. Yeah.
So the next question is from David Mitch, who I've just added. So if you want to ask your question, David.
Okay, I mean, I basically put it in the chat, but I'm wondering to what extent the exam questions may have changed over time. And this partly could reflect sort of varying attitudes towards sort of what are the real classics that should be mastered and so on. I mean, I think there were some divergences of views as to what were the sort of true classics that ought to be learned over time. And I would think, given the long time period that these exams are, they were administered, that could well be subject to change and stuff. So I was wondering about, I don't know how difficult it's going to be to sort of address that issue or what remains of these exam questions, but I was just wondering if these questions could be changing over time. And then it also could be a way of addressing some of the affirmative action issues by varying the nature of the exam questions.
So unfortunately, I think they try not to, so during the period we're looking at, right, 1650 to 1840, so those are the periods the exam questions have stayed relatively comparable to each other. So towards the very end, I think there was like after the Opium War, they did trying to bring in other questions or make it like more relevant for the world of politics and that. Before it was just classics. So it's trying to, I think in some sense, it doesn't really matter what the questions are. It just needs to be people who are hardworking and diligent and well versed in the classics. So yeah, so exam questions themselves have stayed very similar over this period.
Okay, Rui has a question.
Yeah, something that you mentioned in passing, clan schools, right? Some of these candidates could go to clan. And this is to raise the issue that we all know that Chinese society was structured along these long lineages, right? These clans that actually pooled resources to create schools, to provide the resources so that the brightest or the most promising amongst them could actually pay the opportunity cost to take on these exams. So we all know that there's these lineages data sets. So could you cross your data with these lineages and see, for instance, very simple things, right? To see whether there's a lineage fixed effect, or whether the number of scholars who passed the exams in previous generations actually has an impact, right? So if you're thinking about transmission of human capital, not in a genetic sense, of course, but in the idea that perhaps certain clans had invested traditionally more resources onto development human capital. And then the very second short question. So once these scholars passed the exams, they had to be appointed. And appointment was more or less discretionary, except for the fact that they couldn't be appointed to the prefecture they come from, right? So there was this law of avoidance for obvious reasons. Could you study whether people from these lower-ranking provinces actually got more profitable appointments, in the sense that they more disproportionately after the reform got the top jobs? And
yeah, and to add to Rui's question there, they're initially allocated to a role, but I doubt they stay there all their life. I mean, the Prime Minister doesn't get allocated straight out of school, right? So there's some sort of career progression. You measure the highest attained posts at the end of their career, and I was wondering if you can exploit the stuff that happens in between. So it sort of follows up from what Rui's second question was there.
Yeah, so there's several questions. So clan school, that's a great suggestion. I think we should do this. I don't know how much that clan data set actually helps, because they just count like how many lineage books there are, but still it's something, and you might be able to do something like that. I don't think there's actually lineage data, in the sense of having like knowing the generations of like the micro data about the which clan had what graduates and what yet. I think that is actually not easily available, but it's something that could be done like in some other projects in the future. It would be very interesting for sure. Yeah, I think it would be like if someone can do Carol Shear's project at the national level, where it's like a lot of clans and interact with this reform, it would be very interesting. It would be much more more micro founded. Appointment. So right now, our analysis does take into account this to some extent, but it's mostly the ranking. I don't know what's the best way to study how profitable they are, but there are some other dimensions we can exploit.
So there's this gazetteers, right? It's very detailed gazetteers that gives you at least tax information, right? You could be the same ranking official in a poor and a super rich province or prefecture.
So those are also so yes, so we don't, so first I think right now what we do is just at the ranking, right, at the level of the positions and itself, which will really find that it's not very consistent. I would say, like it's like something like they're being shortchanged to some extent, and I don't know why, but there's some indication for this. That could be one of the things that could be similar to what I think we will find if we find some ways to also find those other aspects of these positions, which I think is quite possible actually. We do know what kind of job they had and where they were. It's dispatched to, so that is also available. So those are like additional dimensions of those positions. And yeah, I think I agree with you. It's going to be also quite informative. We only know the initial position and the final position. So that's yeah. So to do any more than what we currently do is also going to be just about initial position and final position. There is this separate data set now is available, I think, for certain periods. It's by Cameron Combal's team. Once that is available for more time periods, then yes, I think it's also going to be like another project almost, trying to see if the career progression, right, for those people who are completing newcomers and they have no network, and there is no pre-existing role models or people who are already in the bureaucracy that can mentor them or help them. What exactly they, what conditions they face, how does that affect their advancement or progression in the career ladder?
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're out of time now. So you'll get sent the questions that were in the chat. I think we can stop recording probably now. But thanks very much again for your work. And do I press the stop recording?
No, you don't have to. Don't worry
I don't
about
have
that.
to.
Just leave.
Don't worry.
Just leave.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you, Boshao. You've been there in the background, and I hope to see as many of you next week.
See you next week.
Thank you.